Hi, welcome to a brief intro to ethics and ethical decision making. My name is Gwendolyn Downing. I go by Gwen, and my pronouns are she, hers. This video has two sections, ethics foundations and ethical decision making. Some information about this video. The purpose of this video is for personal and group usage. And in the video description is a link to the handout, a link to the practitioner's guide for ethical decision making, and instructions to obtain the Ethical Decision-Making Model at a Glance PNG. Then disclaimers. This video and any associated handouts and materials are provided for informational purposes only, and inclusion does not indicate endorsement of any information nor any sources, and as recognized, information is what it is and may be constantly evolving. And then disclosure. I'm the originating director of the Connect All initiative, which has 501c3 fiscal sponsorship by We the World. Okay. So let's get into section 1, ethics foundations. And in this section, we have 4 slides and then a processing slide. And to begin this section, I want us to keep in mind that ethics are created within ecological systems by individuals who each have their own ecological system. And positive or negative, there is interconnection. At least 2 possible points of that. There's the impact of the system on the individuals before they create ethics. And then there's the impact of those ethics on the system. And to kind of speak to this, I'm going to play a quote by Dr. Angela Coombs, taken from PBS's Mysteries of Mental Illness Hysteria clip.
Historically, medicine in general and also psychiatry have looked at themselves as immune to the impact of society and culture, as if that it would be unbiased, right? And totally just trying to be scientific. But you see from the very beginning ways that people try to make sense of what they're seeing that are completely shaped and informed by the ways in which the world is biased.
And what Dr. Coombs said takes us to that interconnection in the ecological system. Okay, so if we're going to be ethical, we need to define what that means, and we're going to broaden our discussion to include moral and legal. And what I'm going to do is ask a question, and then because this video is a video, I'm just going to give one beat before I share the answers. So if you do want time to think before the answers are given, pause the video during that beat, okay? All right, so let's begin with the definitions. How would you define moral, ethical, and legal? Okay, so moral is a person's standards for what is and is not acceptable to them. Ethical is according to an external code or set of rules. And any group can have an external code, okay? Then legal is somewhere there is a law. All right, so next question. Are they for the good? And for all 3, we have the same answer. They don't have to be, and even if they're intended to be, they may not be. So then, are they changeable? And for all 3, we have all 3 can change. They may not, but they are capable of changing. And then in any given situation, what is their relationship with the other 2? Okay, and I'll say that question again. In any given situation, what is each of their relationship with the other 2? So they may align or they may have conflicts, all right? So it could be that all 3 are in alignment, or 2 of them are in alignment and 1 isn't, or 2 of them have conflict, or only 1 of them has conflict with another, or 2 of them have conflict. Sorry, I messed that one up a little bit. But they may align or they may have conflicts. And then last question, are they enforceable? And we're going with, yes, a person could enforce themselves, but in general, my morals are not enforceable by others, right? And then ethical is it depends. There are a lot of ethical codes that have no way of enforcing them being enforced. And then legal is usually. You'd think it'd be always, but it's usually. Okay. So let's go back to our opening point. that morals, laws, and ethics are happening within an ecological system with interconnection. So when we think about the four bullets, what is included in each? What are my morals? What's in my ethical code? What are our laws? Are they for the good? Are they trying to be for the good? Are they changing, not changing? Is something blocking change? What is their relationship with the other two? Right? All of that is in that ecological context. And then we also want to think of any possible impacts of what's happening with them in that context. Okay, so now let's consider ethical codes and rules. And within these, we have two general categories. The first is considerations, principles, and values, and the other is standards. Now, not all codes have both, but if they do, in general, not always, I'm going to say that again, in general, not always, what is the difference? Okay, so our considerations, principles, and values are considered guides or aspirations for our behaviors and decisions. And then our standards are things that we can be held accountable for. All right. And then continue with codes and rules. When we think about our codes, we definitely need to know our own, right? Any codes or rules we fall under, we need to know. And then it can also be helpful to know more than ours, because that can help with understanding of our field and colleagues and give us ideas. And if this is applicable to you and you'd like to, in Appendix A, there are some links to national codes for mental health providers and victim assistance providers. Okay, and this brings us to the end of this section. So we have 3 questions for this section. From what was covered, what was something significant to you? Regarding your work, thoughts about how morals, ethics, and laws are in an ecological system apply. And then any next steps. Do you want to review your code just in general to refresh yourself on it? Maybe review it with a different lens, thinking about it within an ecological system, or maybe you want to read a peer's code. Okay. And if you do need to take a break for the next section, please do so. And moving into section 2, ethical decision making. And we have 10 slides here and then a processing slide. And we're going to begin with ethical decisions. So with ethical decisions, we have 3 general categories. We have simple right, wrong, right? This is very clear. It's simple and it's right or it's wrong. Then we have it's complex, but at the end of everything, we still have what's right and what's wrong. And then we have complex, it depends. That if we got all our peers and colleagues together, we would get different answers. Okay. And then I'm not going to give you the answer to this, but can you think of an example to each? So then with ethical decisions, how do we approach them? And one way that can be beneficial is to have an ethical decision-making model. And why is that? Well, you could think it's a good way to double check myself. I know how to make ethical decisions, but it might be good to have a way to check. And then here's another answer, if you didn't think of this, you might want to consider. And this comes from our practitioner's guide to ethical decision making, that if you follow a systematic model, you can be assured that you'll be able to give a professional explanation for the course of action you choose. So that's a pretty good reason. And if I was doing this live, I would ask if you already had a model you use, and we'd do some comparison as we go. But for now, okay, pardon me. While there are multiple models, I'll be going over an at-a-glance I used to train with, and it is an adaptation from the Practitioner's Guide to Ethical Decision Making. So I'm going to repeat that the video description has a link to the Practitioner's Guide, and then this is the at-a-glance PNG, and the instructions for it are in the video description. Okay? All right. And then I mentioned that there are a lot of ethical decision-making models. If you already have a model that you may already have a model that works better for you, and if you do, please share it in the video chat. or video comments. Sorry, Zoom meets video, right? Um, or Zoom meeting meets video. And then you may get inspired to make your own at a glance. That'd be my other comment for this. All right. Now, since mine is an adaptation, I want to give you a very, and I'm going to repeat, very cursory overview of the practitioner's guide. And I know you'll take time to read it when you have a chance. So they have their introduction, then they go into their foundational principles. Then they go into their steps of the ethical decision-making model, where they're giving their explanation. Then there is their at a glance, and then the concluding paragraph. And in the conclusion, that has the quote from earlier about following a systemic model. And it also talks, pardon me, let me start over again. And it also talks about documentation in the client file. And so while not all ethical decisions you may encounter are client specific, keep in mind documentation. Okay. So here is the at a glance we are using where it's a little easier to see. And I'll be going over it and comparing it to the original and giving an explanation for each step. But for right now, the only thing I want to do is bring your attention to the very last sentence. Don't forget documentation and parking lot. And while I'll be mentioning these again, I want you to know now where they are on the at a glance. And on the note of documentation, on page 9 in your handout, there is an example grid. And in your handout, it is in portrait, okay? But it's this grid. Now, also in your handout, there's a Google Drive link to the Word version in case you want to use this grid and adapt it, all right? Obviously, you can also make your own template based on your model. There's no use reinventing the wheel if we can share them, right? Okay. Oh, and then if you're looking at this grid and going, that is a lot more than I saw in the at a glance, you are correct, but I will be covering all the elements. Okay, so we're going to go through the comparison and I'll give a brief explanation of each step as we go. And to orient you to the slides, the original at a glance is on the left and the adapted is on the right. So the first difference is before we get into the steps, I added during each step, stay aware, not away. That's opposite what we want to do. Stay aware of your pyramid, your body, behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. And here's your knowledge check thought question. Why is that important? Okay. And I'm not giving you an answer for that one. That one's one for you to think through. All right. So then we go into the steps. And I am going to treat the first two differently than the rest. And you'll understand why by the end. Okay. So for step 1, they have identified the problem. I have gather information and identify the problem. Then their step 2 is apply the ACA Code of Ethics. And my step 2 is identifying ethical values, standards, and other considerations and decide. All right. Now I'm going to give a longer brief explanation for these two. And to do so, we're going to go to another slide. Okay. I know, a lot of boxes. We're going to talk through them and they'll make more sense. Or they'll make sense. Okay, so if my step 1 is I want to gather information and identify the problem, there are multiple ways to approach that. And I'm just going to take us through one. All right, so I'm going to gather my initial information about the situation. All right, and I want to start by separating out what is just facts, right? So no assumptions, hypotheses, gut feelings, anything here, just straight facts. Now, as needed, I may need to check who or what are the sources of the facts, and this can be an evolving list, okay? Then I want to have 2 other categories I'm putting together. What are possible sources of the issue? And what are possible impacts of the issue? And as needed, and if possible, during this process, I want to learn more facts, and I might want to learn more possible sources and possible impacts, or I may be wanting to learn more about the ones I'm listing out here. And on possible sources and possible impacts, oops, that slide was not supposed to come up yet. We'll see that one in a minute. And on possible sources and possible impacts, when you're putting these lists together, this is where you can put hypotheses, guesses, ideas, anything can go into those, all right? Now, as I'm going through this process, these arrows indicate that my facts may help me think of, okay, what are possible sources? But then also, as I'm getting my information together, those possible sources may become facts, right? I may identify, oh, this is the source of the issue and it needs to go into the fact box, all right? Um, so if I have gone through this process, I might, okay, and I'm being very clear, I might now be able to identify the problem, okay? And I also may be able to identify what kind of problem it is: ethical, legal, professional, clinical, system issue, or combination. All right. And so, and that would be step one. I would have gathered my information and identified the problem. And before we move on, I want to say on the gathering the information part, one of the reasons I made that specific on the at a glance is when I get all this information together, while I may not need all of it to identify the issue in this first step, this may be information I need to come back through as I go through the rest of the process, or this could be information that may apply to another situation I encounter and I already have it gathered here, right? So I want to gather my information, identify the problem. Okay, so now let's go to step two. And step two is identify any ethical values, standards, and other considerations, such as other codes, rules, policies, and laws that apply, and then make a decision. And I'll explain the decision in a minute because I want to go back to this first part of this. This to identify our values, standards, and other considerations. And this is where I'll go to that Venn diagram. We do have a Venn in between step one, identifying the problem, and step two, identifying the values, codes, rules, and anything else that applies. Sorry, having some breathing issues today, apparently. And so my step one, to identify the problem, I may need to go through all of my values, codes, and other applicable rules, laws, and so on to identify the problem. Okay, so that's where we have the Venn in between step one and step two. And let me go back to the slide. So it could be that to get to or identify the problem, I've read through a lot of these. But now for step two, what I want to do is be very specific to reviewing these again based on the identified problem. So it could be, so it would be that I now know, since this is the ethical standard that applies, I need to think through that to how I address the problem, right? And that brings us to the decision part. Having identified what all applies, it may be that it is very clear what I need to do, that my ethics says this, my policy says this, they're in alignment, this is a clear decision, right? So then I would decide I know what to do here. Or it could be, this is a complex situation and I need to go through the rest of the steps, okay? Now, 2 points on the if you think you know what to do. Even if you think you know what to do, it might be helpful to review at least the at-a-glance steps just to double check that one of those steps couldn't help you in the what you need to do. And that will make more sense as we go through them. And then the other point is, if you think you know what to do, while you do have to act on facts, you might also consider actions for possibilities, especially things you couldn't rule in and out. Okay? So that would be steps one and two. And before we go on, I do want to bring your attention to this parking lot piece. It applies to steps 1 and 2, but it also applies to any of the steps in our decision-making model. That as I'm doing this, if there's anything not pertinent to the immediate situation that I want to learn more about or do, it goes into my parking lot. So it could be as I'm going through all my gathering information and I'm looking at practices to figure out if that's the source, that I'm like, oh man, this is not something that applies to this, but we could do this practice better, right? So that would be my do. Or it could be, I'm like, oh wow, this cultural issue I didn't know about. It doesn't really apply here, but that's on my learn more list. Okay. All right. So those are steps 1 and 2 in parking lot. Okay. And I need a breath in just 1 second here. All right. So now let's go into the rest of our steps. And this is our last slide before we go into questions and closing. Okay. So their step 3 and my step 3 are the same in that they begin the same. And it's determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma. And then mine has 4 points underneath, and I'll explain those in a minute. But first, let me explain determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma. In this first step, what we're really doing is getting into the complexity of the issue and creating a knowledge base for our course of action. Okay, so to do that, these 4 bullet points might help. And these 4 bullets are actually included in their explanation. I just thought having them bulleted out could be beneficial. And then I did tweak 1 and 4. So as I go through them, I'll point those tweaks out. So the very first one I tweaked, as I mentioned, and that I start with having PRN because not everyone has considerations, values, principles, things like that in their codes. But if applicable and as needed, examine the implications for your ethical values. And I did use the word values. They had principles. Okay. And so when I'm looking at my ethical values or standard or not standards, my ethical values or principles or considerations, I want to look at which ones apply to this situation. I want to see if there's maybe more than one that applies, but they're in conflict. And so then how do I decide which one to choose, or how do we approach that? It may be beneficial to consult the literature, to consult with peers or supervisor, or consult with your state, national, or other professional organizations. And the only thing I tweaked on this one was I added the word other. Okay. So then my 4 through 7 matches their 4 through 7. All right. So number 4 is we want to generate potential courses of action. And this one I have an alliteration for. I use brainstorming and buddies. And because I'm going to brainstorm, I am going to think of everything I can think of as a potential course of action. It doesn't have to be well thought out. If I'm like, oh, that just might be, I want to get that all written down. And then the buddies part is, well, let's be honest. Colleagues, supervisors, peers isn't a good alliteration. But I want someone working with me, if possible, who is qualified to help me understand ethical decisions, helping me generate these courses of actions, because they may think of things I won't, right? So brainstorming and buddies for number 4. All right, so then I have my list of here's all the possible things I might do. So number 5 is I want to consider the potential consequences of all those options and determine my course of action. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to review and like, that's a bad idea. These are both equally good, but this one seems like it may have more consequences than this one. So let's go with this one. And I'm going to narrow my list down to what I think I want to do. All right. So then number 6 is I'm going to evaluate that course of action. All right. And I want to look at things like, now that I have this course, if I do this course, are there any other ethical or other considerations that are going to come up, right? And then also, they talk about how you can use 3 simple tests: justice, publicity, and universality. And so justice is, am I being fair? Would I treat someone else the same, right? Publicity. What if my decision was made public, right? And then universality. Would I recommend this to another colleague in the same situation? Okay. So if you can answer yes, then we move forward. But if there's anything in that course of action that doesn't align, then we go back up and start working through our steps again. Okay. Well, the steps that apply again. All right. So let's say we get to our course of action we want to use, then we're going to implement it. And sometimes that isn't easy, but we all know we got to do what we need to do, right? All right. So then number 8 is one I added, and it is that after implementation, assess and consider how the situation might be prevented in the future. And they had the after implementation assess included in the explanation of their number 7. Um, I thought it needed its own bullet point. And then I added the part on considering the situation. As we know, prevention is key, correct? Okay. Then the last thing on the at a glance that's not here is the um, remembering documentation parking lot. But since we've already discussed that, and also this slide is already very full, I didn't put it on here. Okay. And that is the end of that part of our section. And so now we're at our questions and 3 questions. 1, how does your current approach compare? And if you do use a model, again, please share that in the video comment section. We all can share resources with each other. Then question 2, if you don't already have an ethical decision-making model, or you don't consistently use the one you have, what is your next step? And then 3, what are dilemmas you might need this or a different model for? All right. And I'll give you a few examples for that one. Maybe there's differing points in ethical code you're under, or maybe it's in between your ethics and like a pair source regulation or a policy or a law. But think through what dilemmas you run into that this or another model could be beneficial for. All right. So that is the brief intro to ethics and ethical decision making. And thank you and take care.